V'siyata d'ishmaya, we're going to learn Pesachim Daf Yotes. We're going to start 4 lines from the bottom of the Omid. Says the Gemara, Tnan Hosom, we learned a Mishnah in Masechet Idiois, and it happens to be, it's another testifying that was said by Reb Chanina Skana Koyanim. Al machat shenimtzeis bebosar. If a needle was found inside the meat inside the flesh of a korban, of a kodesh animal, shahasakin v'hayodayim tohiris. The hands that dealt with this animal are tohir. The knife that was used to cut the animal is tohir. V'habosar tomei. However, the flesh of this korban, the meat, is tomei because of the tumah of the needle. Nimtzeis beparosh, if they found this needle in the excrement of the animal, hakil tohir, then the whole thing, everything is tohir. And obviously the Gemara is going to discuss what we're talking about, how tomei the needle is, why only the flesh is tomei, not the hands that dealt with the animal or the knife that cut the animal. We'll see all that in the Gemara. That's the end of a quote from a Mishnah in Idios. And now there's another quote. Omer Rabbi Yehuda, Zachinu, we're very fortunate, she'ein tumas yodayim b'mikdash, that the Chachomim did not make their gezerah of tumas yodayim in the Beis HaMikdash, and that's why the yodayim are tahiros. Asks the Gemara, v'neima she'ein tumas yodayim v'kelim b'mikdash. If Rabbi Akiva is responding to that Mishnah, and the Mishnah there says that it's true that the flesh of the animal is tomei, but not only are the hands tohir, but the knife is also tohir. So why didn't Rabbi Akiva respond that we're fortunate that the Chachomim did not make their gezerah, that kelim, referring to utensils, the knife, that ein tumas yodayim v'kelim b'mikdash. Fortunate are we that the Chachomim did not decree a tumah on the kelim in the Beis HaMikdash, obviously assuming that the type of tumah that we're talking about here is a type of tumah that would not make the hands nor the utensils tomei min haTorah. Outside the Beis HaMikdash, a similar scenario, they would be tomei midrabanon. Rabbi Akiva is saying, fortunate are we that in the Beis HaMikdash they did not make such isurim, such takonis. So the Gemara is asking, why did Rabbi Akiva only address the hands, not the utensils? Omer of Yehuda Amarav, Yitemi Rabbi Yosi bar Chanina, Yodayim koidem gzeras kelim nishnu. We're talking, the reason is because the takona, the gezerah of tumas yodayim midrabanon was made long before the gezerah of kelim. And at that point that Rabbi Akiva was talking, tumas yodayim existed, and therefore Rabbi Akiva commented that we're fortunate that they didn't make their gezerah in the Beis HaMikdash, and the gezerah on kelim did not yet exist. Asks the Gemara Omarova, v'hotarvayu boi bayim gozru. The gezerahs on the tumah derabanon on the yodayim, on a person's hands, and the tumah on utensils, if liquids touch utensils, they were made on the same day. There was no difference in time between them. Ditnan, as we learnt in a Mishnah in Zovim, HaSefer, which is the Sifrei Kodesh from the Tanakh, v'hayodayim, and the person's hands, v'tvul yoim, and Chazal tell us, the Gemara says that tvul yoim doesn't belong here because tvul yoim is min haTorah, v'ha'oichlin, and certain situations of foods that are tomei, v'hakelim, and kelim, utensils that became tomei from liquids which are only midrabanon, and v'kelim shenitmu b'mashkin. All these gezeros were made on the same day. So it mentions here also the yodayim and also the kelim. So how can you, Rav Yehuda Marav or Rabbi Yosi bar Chanina, how can you say that the reason that Rabbi Akiva only addressed the yodayim and not the kelim is because of the difference in time between them? That's clearly not the case. Ella Omar Rava explained why Rabbi Akiva only addressed the hands and not the kelim. Hanach l'tumas sakin. Regarding the tumas yodayim, we're outside the Beis HaMikdash in a similar scenario. The hands would have been tomei. Rabbi Akiva said we're fortunate that in the Beis HaMikdash they did not make the tumas yodayim. But in the case of the knife that we're talking about here, da'afilu b'chulin nami lo metame, even outside the Beis HaMikdash, even if it's not kodesh animal, it's just a chulin animal, the knife would also not be tomei. Why? Because hai sakin denoga b'mai. What would make this knife tomei? Even outside the Beis Hamikdash. Ilema denoga b'basar. Is it because the knife touched the flesh? Ha'in oichel metame kli. We know that oichlim, even midrabanon, oichlim are not metame kelim. Mashkim are metame kelim midrabanon, because if they are because the mashkim could get confused with the liquid, or the liquids of a zov or a zova, which are very severely tomei. Not to get confused between different types of liquids, the Chachomim made a gezerah. On foods, they didn't make such a gezerah. Ve'elo denoga b'machat. You want to say that the knife outside the Beis Hamikdash would become tomei because it touched this needle, which the needle is obviously tomei. V'ha'in kli metame kli. We know that kelim are not metame kelim at all, even midrabanon. So, if so, this knife is never going to be tomei, not if it's outside the Beis Hamikdash, and also obviously not in the Beis Hamikdash. And therefore Rabbi Akiva had no reason to comment on how fortunate we are that the Chachomim didn't say Tumas Kelim in the Mikdash, because in this scenario there was no discussion of the Kelim, of the knife. Now the Gemara is addressing this needle, which was the cause of the whole issue here. My avidite, hi machat, my avidite. What's the story? What happened to this needle that's making the flesh of the korban tomei and not making anything else tomei? Inema sofik machat. If you're saying that it's a machat, that it's a sofik if it's tomei or if it's not tomei. Did we not learn that from Rabbi Loza and Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina, Chad Omar lo yigozru al sofik haroikin shebYerushalayim, v'chad Omar lo yigozru al sofik hakelim shebYerushalayim. Did they not say that one of them said that when you find saliva in Yerushalayim, you do not need to suspect that it came from a zov whose saliva is seriously tomei, and you can assume it came from a toher person. If it's just a doubt, a sofik, you can be lenient. And the other opinion held that with kelim, that there's a sofik if they're tomei, we're allowed to assume that they're toher. So if so, why is this needle tomei? If in Yerushalayim, lo yigozru al sofik hakelim shebYerushalayim, then this needle, if it's a sofik, if it's tomei, it should be deemed as toher, and even the meat should be toher. So Omar of Yehuda, Omar Rav, we're talking about that this needle was definitely tomei, not a sofik. Somebody who touched a mace, touched this needle, and we've learned previously that since this needle is metal, anything metal that touches an av hatumah, namely a person who touched a dead person, the needle does not go down a level and become a rishon, it becomes an av hatumah. And this needle that's an av hatumah is now v'hikira b'basar. He now realizes, here it is in the flesh of this animal. The animal obviously swallowed it, and therefore the flesh became tomei. Rabbi Yossi bar Ovin Omar, Rabbi Yossi bar Ovin gives a different explanation as to what happened to this needle. Kegoin shehoisa poro chasuma uba michutz liYerushalayim. He goes back, he reverts back to what we said before. Indeed, we're talking about a needle that is a sofik if it's tomei. And nonetheless, you asked a question, in Yerushalayim, they allowed you to rely that all needles, sofik kelim in Yerushalayim are toher. Yeah, that's if the sofik is in Yerushalayim. Here, the animal actually, when all the while it was in Yerushalayim, it was chasuma, it was muzzled, it didn't swallow anything. And uba michutz Yerushalayim, the animal actually swallowed this needle outside Yerushalayim. Outside Yerushalayim, we have no right to assume that it's toher. And therefore, you've got this needle that's a sofik tomei, and therefore the flesh of this korban became tomei. Continues the Gemara, gufa. And now we're going back to a couple of points we mentioned previously in this Gemara, that we saw that regarding in Yerushalayim, if you have a sofik, then Rabbi Loza Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina, Chad Omar lo yigozru al sofik haroikin shebYerushalayim. One of them held that if you have a doubt whether the saliva came from a toher person or a seriously, severely tomei person, you're allowed to assume that it came from a toher person, because these tumeim were not roaming around Yerushalayim. V'chad Omar, the other opinion said, lo yigozru al sofik hakelim b'Yerushalayim. If you had a sofik where the certain kelim were tomei in Yerushalayim, you're allowed to assume they're toher, because there was no reason to believe that tomei kelim found their way to Yerushalayim. And the Gemara is going to say now, Roikin Tanina, Kalim Tanina. Both these halachas, one that was said by Rabbi Lozo and the other one that was said by Rabbi Yosi bar Chanina, both of them have Tanaic sources. Roikin Tanina, this halacha that if you have a suffix regarding saliva in Yerushalayim that you can assume is tahir, is a Mishnah Ditnan we learned in a Mishnah. Kol haroikin animtzoim b'Yerushalayim. If you find saliva anywhere in Yerushalayim, tahirin, you're allowed to assume it's tahir. Chutz mishel shuk elyon. Besides for one of the higher level marketplaces, which was out of the way, and the Tameim, all the Tomei people would collect there in order not to make the Torah people in Yerushalayim Tomei. And since over there were many Tameim, if you find saliva in that marketplace, then indeed you have to assume that it may be Tomei. But anywhere else in Yerushalayim, it's Tahir. And the Gemara actually means to ask a question. Why are you saying that either Rabbi Lozo or Rabbi Yosi bar Chanina, you're saying on your own accord that Roikin Yerushalayim is Tahir? It's an explicit Mishnah. What are you coming to teach us? Says the Gemara, Loi. It's not so straightforward. Tzricha, there's room for an added expression of a Chiddush, Af al Gav de Ischazik Zov. That they added that even though you know that a Zov who is severely Tomei walked through this place in Yerushalayim, nonetheless, since he's the absolute minority there, you do not need to assume that the saliva that's found there came from this Zov. You're allowed to assume that it's Tahir. And that's something you wouldn't have seen in the Mishnah. The Mishnah was not talking about a case, or didn't explicitly mention a case, where we know that a Zov walked through. Continues the Gemara, Kalim, this that we say that Kalim, that are Sofik Tum in Yerushalayim, you're allowed to assume that Tahir, Tanina, it's also a Mishnah. Ditnan we learnt, Kol ha-Kalim animtzoim b'Yerushalayim. Any Kalim that you find in Yerushalayim, then Derech Yerida lebeis haTvila. In the pathway going down to the mikveh, there, Tameim, we assume these Kalim are Tomei. Why would somebody take Kalim on a path going down to a mikveh, if not that the Kalim are Tomei and needed to be toveled in the mikveh? Hada Alma, Tahirin. But anywhere else in Yerushalayim that you find Kalim, they're Tahir. So why are you saying on your own accord that Kalim in Yerushalayim are Tahir? It's an explicit Mishnah. So the answer back, even according to you, Eima Seifa, Derech Aliyah Tahirin. How are you going to understand a diuk that you have from the next part of the Mishnah? The Mishnah there says that if you find the Kalim on the way up from the mikveh, then it's Tahir. And we can deduce from there, Had Alma, but Kalim found in the rest of Yerushalayim, Tameim, they're Tomei, even though it's a suffix. You don't know that they're Tomei, you assume that they're Tomei. And that's contrary to the halacha that we just saw, that suffix Kalim in Yerushalayim are Tahir. Ela Reisha Dafka. The main part of the Mishnah that we're supposed to deduce from is the first part of the Mishnah. That only those Kalim that are found on the way down to the mikveh are assumed to be Tomei. And everywhere else in Yerushalayim are Tahir. The Sefer, and this that it says in the Sefer, that the Kalim on the way up from the mikveh are Tahir, and we thought we could deduce from there that Kalim everywhere else in Yerushalayim cannot be assumed to be Tahir, Lav Dafka. No, that's not Dafka. Afuke Gezaisa. All that last part of the Mishnah is coming to say is that the pathways going up from the mikveh, they are definitely Tahir, like the rest of Yerushalayim. However, those narrow alleyways that are close to the mikveh, and it's not clear whether the Kalim there are on the way to the mikveh or on their way from the mikveh. Over there, indeed, you have to assume, in those narrow alleyways, you have to assume that they are Tomei. However, if it's clearly on the way up from the mikveh and not on these alleyways that are on the way down to the mikveh as well, or the rest of Yerushalayim, you can assume that they are Tahir. And when the Gemara asked a question, why are you, Amayiroim, either Rabbi Lozo or Rabbi Yosi bar Chanina, so to speak, introducing to us this halacha that Kalim all over Yerushalayim are Tahir, it's explicit in the Mishnah? No, it's not so explicit in the Mishnah. You could have learnt the Mishnah the other way. You could have deduced from the end of the Mishnah that Kalim in Yerushalayim are Tomei, in the same way as you can deduce from the beginning of the Mishnah that Kalim in Yerushalayim are Tahir. And we needed this Amayra to tell us that the way to learn the Mishnah is that Reisha Dafka, that this Amoira was telling us that the main part of the Mishnah from which we're supposed to deduce the halachas of the kelim that are sofik in Yerushalayim is the ratio of the Mishnah, and that we're supposed to deduce that kelim in Yerushalayim, even the sveikas, are supposed to be deemed as tohir. Continues the Gemara. And we're going now back to what we saw before, Omer of Yehuda Marav, that if you have a needle that touched somebody who touched a mace, then that person who touched a mace is an av. The needle has the same status because it's metal, and any metal utensil that touches a person that touched a corpse is an av hatuma. We're going to discuss that. And now this needle that's an av hatuma was found in this animal. If so, kiven de omar mar bechalal cherev, the pasuk says bechalal cherev, that we're talking about the word halal is actually a corpse, and the cherev is a sword that touched the corpse. And the Gemara learns that cherev hareyu kechalal, that the sword, which is metal, that touched the dead person, has the same status as the dead person, being an avi avois hatuma. And the same applies that a metal utensil that touches a person that touched a corpse is an av hatuma. So the Gemara is asking, Odom v'kelim nami litame. Why are you saying that the yodayim are tohir and the knife is tohir? If we're talking about that the needle is an av hatuma makes a person tomei. So not only the yodayim, the whole person becomes tomei. Tumes yodayim is only in derabonon. Certain situations, the hands become tomei, even though the whole person is tohir. But if a person touches an av hatuma, he becomes a rishon l'tuma. And kelim also, if this knife touches something that's an av hatuma, it's going to become tomei. So why did you say Rav was trying to explain what we saw in the Mishnah in Idios, that machat shenimtzes b'bosa hasakin v'yidayim tohiros, according to Rav, that the needle is an av hatuma, then why is the yidayim and the sakin tohiros? Answers the Gemara, Omer of Ashi, zois oimeres azora rushus horabim hi. Because we're saying that the status of the Azora, as far as the halachas of Tumah and Tahara are concerned, since it's a public place where a lot of people are going through, it has the status of Rishus Harabim. V'havel a Sofik Tumah Rishus Harabim. You don't know 100% that the person touched this needle. You don't know 100% that the knife touched the needle. It's a Sofik. And since it's a sofik in a public place, the halacha is kol sofik tumah b'rishus harabim sveikei toyer. This is learnt out from Saita, that a sofik tumah is only considered tomei if it's in a secluded place, if it's in rishus hayochid. If it's in a public place, then sofik tumah b'rishus harabim toyer. Asks the Gemara, ha b'rishus hayochid, we can deduce from there that had this scenario taken place in a more secluded place, or if the Azora itself, which is where the Korbanos were in the Beis Hamikdash, in the event that it would have the status of a Rishus HaYochid, Tzveikei Tomei, then Tzveikas, the rule is, Sofik Tumah B'Rishus HaYochid is Tomei, like Soita, is Tomehu. So let's work out, Mechta. Let's try and understand this. Hai Machat, Dover She'ein B'I Das Lishelchu. This needle, the source of Tumah, is something which is not something that you can ask a question to. V'chol dover she'ein b'I das l'shoel, bein b'rishus harabim, bein b'rishus hayochid, sveikei tohir. Why are you saying that the reason that the knife is tohir and the reason that the person is tohir is because it's a sofik tumah b'rishus harabim, but even if it was in rishus hayochid, the tumah is coming from a needle? And the needle itself is not something that you can ask a question to. It's an inanimate object. And anything that is inanimate, that you cannot ask a question to, has the halachas of a sofik tumah b'rishus harabim. That means there's no halachas of sofik tumah b'rishus hayochid and sveikei tohir. And it will be tohir even if it wasn't in rishus harabim. So why did the Gemara not answer that the reason that the kelim and the odom is toir is because the needle is something which you cannot ask a question to? Answers the Gemara, Mishum dehava sofik tumah habobi de odom. It's incorrect to say that since the needle is tomei and you cannot ask the needle, did you touch the knife, did you touch the person? Therefore it has the status of Sofik Tumah B'Rishos Harabim and is Toyer. No, because how would the knife have become Tomei? How would the person have become Tomei? Via a person. There was a person holding the knife. It's a Sofik Tumah Haba B'Dei Adam. It's through the person. And a Sofik Tumah that comes through the person has the same status as a Sofik Tumah of somebody you can ask a question to. You can ask the person, when you were holding the knife, did you touch the needle? When you were handling the meat, did you touch the needle? That a suffix that comes from it's passing through a person who can be asked, even if the point of discussion is a utensil that was on the ground and the utensil didn't even move, and the person was holding a sheretz, was holding something tumah, and there's a quest, and the whole discussion was, did he touch this utensil that was on the ground? So it's not even the person who's holding the utensil, and we can ask the person, did you hold this utensil and make it tomei by touching something tomei? No, we're asking the person, did you make this thing tomei that's in your hand touch the vessel on the ground? That's kedava sheyesh bo das lishel, and it has the status of something that you can ask, because the person holding the tumah that would have made the utensil tomei is somebody that you can ask. So too here, the knife and the person that we're discussing was held in the hands of a person. And since we can ask the person, did you touch the needle? Did the knife in your hand touch the needle? Therefore it has the status of something you can ask, and therefore the only reason that they are toyer is because it's considered a Sofik Tumah B'Rishos Harabim. Had it been in Rishos HaYochid, indeed it would be tomei. Continues the Gemara. V'habasar tomei. So what did we see in that Mishnah in Idios? That the meat where this needle was found, the flesh of the animal, is tomei. And as we said, either there was a needle that was a Sofik Tumah in the event that the animal swallowed it outside Yerushalayim, or that it's Vadai Tumah and it was a needle that was an Av HaTumah. Then we said that the flesh is tomei. But we've learned previously that any food item, before it can become tomei, it needs to become susceptible to become tomei. How does that happen? By one of the 7 liquids touching it. Over here, hai basar, this meat, de iskasher b'mai. What made it susceptible to become tomei? We're talking about a freshly shechted korban, an animal in the Beis Hamikdash. There's no liquids in sight, so it's an animal that could not become tomei, wasn't susceptible to becoming tomei, and even if the needle is in there and it's tomei, the meat would not become tomei. Are you going to say that since one of the 7 liquids is blood, and over here when you shecht an animal, the blood is touching the animal? No. And we've already saw this before in Daf Tezayin Amud Aleph. Minayin ledam kochim, blood of a kochim animal, she'einoi machshir. It does not make the animal or anything susceptible to becoming tomei. Why? Shenemar, it says in the pasuk, lo yisoich alenu, you're not allowed to eat and drink blood. Ala oretz tishbechenu, you should pour it onto the floor. Kamayim, like water. Dam shenishbach kamayim, only the type of blood that gets poured out like water, machshir, has a status similar to water that can make any food item susceptible to becoming tomei. V'she'einu nishbach kamayim, however, the blood of a korban, where you're not allowed to allow it to pour out on the floor, you have to receive it in a kli shoris and sprinkle some of it onto the mizbeach. That type of blood, einoi machshir, does not make anything susceptible to becoming tomei. So the question comes back, what made this animal susceptible to become tomei, that you said in that Mishnah in Idios that the meat, the flesh of the animal is tomei? Ve'elo, says the Gemara, is kasher b'mashke beis mitbachaya. It's obviously talking about that there's water in the butchery there in the Beis Hamikdash, and the water there in the beis mitbachaya is touching the animal, and that made it susceptible to become tomei. But did Rabbi Yosi bar Chanina not say, and we learnt this on Daf Tezayin Amud Aleph, that mashke beis mitbachaya, that the liquids in the Beis Hamikdash, the water in the Beis Hamikdash, lo yidayon sheim dochon, not only those waters themselves are tohir, elo she'ein machshirin. They do not make anything else susceptible to become tomei. So the waters in the Beis Hamikdash will not make the animal susceptible to become tomei. And again, the question comes back: how did the flesh become tomei? Ve'elot iskasher b'chibas hakodesh. Since it's flesh of hekdesh, then the esteem that we give to this very holy and sacred meat, that in itself gives it the status of a food that is susceptible to becoming tomei. Continues the Gemara, you're telling me that the flesh became tomei because of chibas hakodesh? The term used in that Mishnah in Idios was habasar tomei. It doesn't say the basar is possible, that the chibas hakodesh allowed the meat to become tomei if something tomei touched it, to the extent that you're not allowed to eat this animal, this flesh. It didn't say that. It says tomei. Tomei means that if an av touched this flesh, the flesh becomes a rishon. If a rishon touched it, the flesh becomes a sheni, etc. So if so, we understand that chibas hakodesh always works in order to make something possible, but not to make it tomei. Here it says tomei, only that you're not allowed to eat it. But but in order that it should make something else tomei, which means it has the status of tumah, according to the stage and the level of tumah that touched it. If so, tifshoit de boyer Rish Lakish, then you can answer the question Rish Lakish asked. Rish Lakish asked, tzritchel menochis, if you have a dry lump of menochis, which is just flour, no liquid touched it, and something else then, tomei, touched this dry lump of the menochis, then the Rish Lakish asked, "Moinin by Rishon v'Sheni oiloi." We understand that this mincha itself cannot be eaten because of chibas hakodesh. But Rish Lakish asked, "Does it become Rishon or Sheni, or do we say no? It's just possible." The only ramification of the fact that something tomei, anything tomei touched it, any level of tumah touched it, is only that you're not allowed to eat it. Or do we say no? It actually receives a certain level of tumah that can make other things tomei. And if we're saying that the word v'abasar tomei in the Mishnah in Idios is because of chibas hakodesh, then we should answer Rish Lakish's question. So says the Gemara, Omer Rav Yehuda Mashmuel. Rav Yehuda Mashmuel says the reason the flesh is tomei is not chibas hakodesh. Chibas hakodesh can only make it possible, but to make it tomei, for that there must be liquids that went on it. What's the case? We're back to our original question. Where did liquids go anywhere near this animal? We're talking about a cow that was actually a korban shlomim, and the owners were going to skin the animal and eat the animal, and they wanted to make it to beautify the animal and make it easier for them to skin and to eat. And therefore, they actually led the animal through a river, through some water, before bringing it into the Beis Hamikdash, v'shachato, and then they shechted it whilst v'adayin mashke toifech olel. There was still some liquids from that wash on the animal, and then when they skinned the animal, some of that water went onto the flesh, and now this flesh is susceptible to become tomei, and there's a machat inside which is tomei, so this needle makes the flesh tomei. Continues the Gemara, that we saw in that Mishnah, the last statement in that Mishnah in Idios, that if you found the needle beporish in the excrement of the animal, hakil tohir, then it's all tohir. And now the Gemara is assuming that this excrement was actually liquidy. So the Gemara is asking, v'nehadir parosh v'nemtaya lebasar. Why did the needle not make the excrement tomei? And the excrement being a liquid, liquids can make solids tomei. Why don't we say that the parosh, the liquid excrement, makes the flesh, which is a solid, become tomei? There's going to be two answers in the Gemara. Omer Rav Ada Ba'ava b'pirish ova. Rav Ada Ba'ava says we're talking about a solidified part of the excrement, and that part of the excrement is not considered as a liquid, it's a solid. And a solid will not make a food item tomei. Rav Ashi Omar, Rav Ashi answers, even if we're talking about a fluid part of the excrement, since this excrement is very repulsive and it's masriach, nobody wants it, nobody would eat it, it's not even considered a liquid that can become tomei and of its own will not become tomei. The first answer of the Gemara, when Rav Ada Ba'ava said it was talking about parosh that was over, that was solid, then the parosh itself would become tomei, because the needle can make this solid, let's call it a type of part of the animal, the excrement of the animal can make it tomei. Just that the excrement, which is solid, will not make the flesh tomei. Now this second answer of Ashi's answer is that even in a liquid state, it's not considered an item that's at all fit to become tomei, and the excrement itself is tahir, and even more so it would not make the animal tahir. And that's what the Mishnah says: if you find the needle in the excrement of the animal, then the flesh of the animal and the excrement of the animal, according to Rav Ashi, remain tahir. In Yitzchok, in the next shiur, we're going to carry on from here.